In this Blender tutorial, we'll be creating this procedural desert planet. So it's going to be created procedurally, meaning that all the materials in the scene will be created procedurally with Blender shader nodes, so we won't be using any texture maps. And this tutorial will work great in both Cycles and Eevee, so I'm going to be using the Cycles rendering engine in this tutorial, but it works great in Eevee. It looks pretty much the same in Cycles and Eevee. So you can use whichever render engine you want. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase the project files, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. The links are in the description. Now, if you like creating sci-fi artworks in Blender, then you might be interested in checking out my sci-fi construction robot Blender tutorial series. So that's an 11-part tutorial course, and throughout the series, I show you how to create this sci-fi construction robot. So the course is all step-by-step and in real time, and we go through the complete process of modeling the robot, doing all the textures and the materials, doing the lighting, and we even rig the robot and then do the animation and render out the animation to get this finished animation here of this construction robot. If you'd like to check out the course trailer video, I'll have a link in the description, and you can check out the product pages linked in the description. So here I am in Blender, and let's start creating the planet. So I'm just going to start by deleting everything, and I'll go to the add menu and I'll go to mesh, and I'm going to add an icosphere. And then before you move the icosphere around, right behind me, you can click here on the add icosphere settings, and I'm just going to turn this up to a 6. And that way you can see it's nice and smooth and round. I can close the add icosphere settings, and then I'll use the object context menu and shade it smooth. And then I thought maybe I'd scale this object up a bit so it's larger. So I'm just going to scale it by 4. So just hit S to scale, type 4, and then enter. So it's a bit bigger. Now before I continue making the planet and the atmosphere, I want to create the background world. So we're just going to add some stars in the background. So I'm going to click here to go to the shading workspace, and I'll go into the rendered viewport mode. Let's click here on object, and we're going to edit the world nodes instead. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop this here, and the Voronoi distance can go into the color of the background. So now you can see we have all these little dots here. And then for the scale, I'm just going to turn this up to like 120. Now let's add a color ramp to make it more contrasty. So I'll search for a color ramp. We're going to drop the color ramp here, and then I'm going to switch the white tab and switch the black tab so they're opposite. And then the black tab, I'm just going to drag it way over here so it's very small. Now I have the viewport denoising on, so it's kind of hard to see the stars because they're really small. We can adjust this later if we need to, but in the final render, you should be able to see just some really small stars. So that's what I'm going to do for the stars in the background. And also the strength here, I'll turn this up to 2 so that the stars are a little bit brighter. Let's click on world, and we can go back to objects so we can edit the shader nodes. And I'll just go back here to the layout for now. Let's also save the project. So I'll just click on file and save the project to my computer. I'll just save this as planet.blend and then save the file. So we're now going to be making the atmosphere. So before I make the atmosphere, I do want to add a sunlight, because if I go into the rendered viewport mode, you can see everything's really dark. So I'll go to the add menu, and let's go down here to light, and we're going to add the sunlight. We can just kind of move the sunlight up here and maybe rotate the sunlight back a bit. And then if we go to the sunlight settings, I want to turn the strength to 4, and then I'll also make it just a very, very slight yellowish color. So to make the atmosphere, I'm going to basically be creating a gradient, and then we'll make it so that the gradient moves whenever the light moves. And so that way you'll only be able to see the atmosphere where the light is, but then when there's no light, you aren't going to be able to see the atmosphere. Now to make the gradient so that it changes when the light changes, we need some sort of object which is going to rotate when the sunlight moves around the object. So I'll press Shift C to make sure the 3D cursor is in the center of the scene, and then I'll go to the add menu. Let's go to empty, and I'm just going to add a plane axis, and I'll scale this object up a bit so that you can kind of see it here so it's popping out of that sphere. And I'm just using an empty object because empty objects don't show up in the render because they don't have any visible faces. So now what I want to do is I want to make it so that when I move the light is always pointed towards the planet. So select the light, and we're going to click right here to go to the object constraint properties. We'll click on add object constraint. We're going to add track 2, and on the target object, we'll click on the eyedropper, and we're going to choose this icosphere. Now when I move the light around, you can see the light is always pointed at the planet. So I can move that around, and that's just a great way to quickly be able to move where the light is, to move the light in the shadow. But then this object here, this object is going to determine where the gradient is, and so I always want this object to be pointed towards the sun. So if we select the empty, we'll click on add object constraint, and we'll also choose a track 2, and we'll click on the eyedropper, and we're going to choose the sun. So now if I move the sun around, you can see the empty is also going to move around with the sun's position. So now I can create the atmosphere material. So we're going to select the object here, and let's go to the shading workspace. And we're going to click on new to add a new material. And for this material, I will just call it Atmo for short. I'll just call it Atmo. So to create this material, we're first going to search for an emission because where the atmosphere is, I want it to kind of glow. And we're going to delete the principled shader. But then I also want to add a transparent shader so that it's transparent. And so it'll just kind of be glowing more on the edges, and then it'll be transparent in the middle. So we'll add a transparent here and an emission here. Then I want to mix them together, so we're going to add a mix shader, and we can put the transparent one to the top one, and the emission can go into the bottom one. And on the emission strength, I'll turn this up to like a 40. We can also plug the mix shader up to the surface. And then this emission color, I'm going to make this kind of a yellowish orangey color. And if you want to use the same color I'm using, the hex value that I'll be using is FF 9269. Now the factor is going to blend between using fully the emission or fully the transparent, but I want to be more transparent in the center and then just be glowing around the edges. So we're going to need to create a mask for this. So we're going to search for the layer weight node. We'll just add the layer weight right here. And if you control shift and select it to preview it, you can turn on the node wrangler add-on and then hold down the control and shift key and select the facing by control shift and clicking it twice. You can see it's black here and then it's white outside. So we're going to use this to make that mask. But I'm going to search for a color ramp to make it more contrasty. So we'll stick the color ramp here after the layer weight. And on the layer weight here on the blend, I'm going to turn it to 0.1, and that way it's going to make it even smaller. But then we can play around with these values to make it even more subtle. Now instead of dragging these around to make it more contrasty, I'm just going to take the white tab here, and I'm going to make the white tab a very, very dark gray so it's very subtle. Because if it's too bright, it's just going to be super strong, and I still want to be able to see through it. It's not supposed to be super bright, it's just going to be a subtle atmosphere. So for this very dark gray, the hex value is going to be 2E, 2E, 2E. So that's going to be the atmosphere, but then I also want to make the atmosphere just be visible where the sunlight is, so we need to create a gradient, and the gradient is going to adapt to where the sun is. So to do this, we're going to search for a texture coordinate node. So we'll drop that right here, and then we can choose an object. So if we click on the object here, we're going to choose the empty object. So we're using the texture coordinate of the empty. Now we're going to search for the separate XYZ node, and we're going to take the object here and we're going to put that into the vector. So now if I control shift and select the separate XYZ, we have the X value, we have the Y value, and we have the Z value. So those are the texture coordinates. And if we select the light here and move the light around, you can see the empty is going to follow the light. You can see if I move the empty around, the empty is going to move where that gradient is. But because the empty is in the very center and it's moving around by the light, so the light is moving it, you can see that's going to change where that gradient is. So I'm going to control shift and select it until we're previewing the Z one, because you can see the Z one is facing the correct way where the sun is. I now want to add a color ramp, so we can just duplicate this color ramp and drop it here. And I now want to drag this gray value way over here, and I can also click on the color and I can make it fully white. And I'm going to drag it way over here so it's really contrasty. So again, you can see if I select the sunlight and move it around, that is moving the gradient. So now what I want to do is mix this color ramp here in with this color ramp. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell it so that where the black part is, that is where you'll be able to see this atmosphere rim. So to do this, we're going to search for a mix color. We're going to drop the mix color here, and we're going to take this color ramp color, and we're going to put that into the factor. So it's basically the mask to tell it that this color ramp here is only going to be visible on this top area. Now this color ramp color can go into color A, and then color B, this can be fully black. So it is a little bit hard to see, but if I deselect this, you can see it's just gray here right on the top. If I take this gray color and make it lighter, you can basically see what it's doing. So this is the mask, so it's telling it that we're only going to be able to see that gradient there on the top, but then of course it's that very dark color, so it's very subtle. So now we can take this mix result and we can put that into the factor of this mix shader to determine what part is transparent and what part is the emission. So if I control shift and select the mix shader, now you can see that the atmosphere is only up here, but then right down here where there's the shadow, you can't see the atmosphere. And of course, if you want to make the atmosphere stronger, you can turn this up. You can see it's brighter, but I want to keep it very, very low down, so it is going to be much more subtle. So that's why I'm using that really dark gray. So now we're going to be creating the planet atmosphere, which is the main procedural material. So I'm going to go back to solid view, and I'm going to select the object, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it. Then I'll hit S to scale, and I'm going to scale it down by just a very small amount. So if I hold down the Z button, go into wireframe, if I zoom in here, you can see we just want to scale this planet object down so it's just slightly smaller, so the atmosphere is just slightly bigger than it. And then with the object selected, the smaller object, we're going to click here to delete the material, and let's click on new to add a new material, and I can rename this to planet. So if I go into the rendered viewport mode, you can see now we have the atmosphere, and then the planet is underneath it. So now we'll create the procedural planet material. So for this material, I'm going to add a noise texture. Let's drop it here, and I'll Control Shift and select it to preview it. And on the noise texture settings, let's change the 3D to 4D instead, and then I'll leave the scale at 5, and then the detail I'll turn to the max of 15, and the roughness I'll turn to a 0.85. And then also on the FBM here, let's change this type to the rigid multifractal instead, so rigid multifractal. And then we're also going to go down here to this gain, and if I turn the gain up, it's going to add some really cool details. So I'm going to turn this gain to 115, so it's super detailed. But I want to make it even more detailed, so we're going to select the noise texture and press Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates, so we're going to put the object into the vector. And we're going to use another noise texture to distort this noise texture. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, drop it here, and the vector can go into the vector this noise. So now we can go to the add menu and we can search for a mix color, and we'll drop the mix color here after this mapping. And we want to mix together the mapping which isn't distorted and this noise which is going to distort it. So this mapping vector will go into color A, and then for color B, we're going to put the noise texture factor into color B. So now you can see we have this factor here. We can drag this around to make it more distorted or less distorted, but I'm actually going to leave it at a 0.5. So now if you zoom in here, you can see we have some really cool details, and it looks like a cool planet with maybe like some small rivers or some mountains and maybe some canyons because it is a desert planet. And then also to make this look a little bit more interesting, we're going to take the mix result and we're also going to put that into the W value, and that makes it look even more interesting. So we have some really cool details there. So now I want to create the colors for the planet. So we're going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to drop the color ramp here after the noise, and then we can make all the different custom colors. So the first one is just going to be fully black, but let's hold down the Control key and click here to add another tab, and then hold down the Control key and click here to add another tab, and then this last tab will kind of drag over a bit. So the first color is going to be kind of this brown color on this one right here, and the hex value is going to be 544437, so you can punch that in if you want to use the same color I'm using. Then this second one here kind of in the middle is going to be a red color, and the hex value is going to be 990C03. And then the last one is going to be kind of a bright peachy color, and the hex value will be FFCFBE. So now the color ramp can go into the base color, and I'll Control Shift and select the material to preview it. And then I also want to add a bit of bump. So we're going to take the factor, we're going to put that into the normal, but then we need to search for a bump node and put the bump node here between the noise texture and the normal. And this bump here, the factor needs to be going into the height value to convert it to bump data. So now you can see the surface looks really bumpy, but I'm going to turn the strength just to like a 0.1 so it is more subtle. So that's it for the planet texture, but I also want to create one more, which is going to be a clouds texture. So I'll go back to solid view. Actually, I'm going to go into the wireframe. Let me make this bigger, and I'm going to zoom in really close. I'll press Shift to duplicate, then I'll hit S to scale, and I'll scale it up just by a very small amount. And I want to scale this up so that the clouds is kind of in between the atmosphere and the planet. So just right there. So we're going to have three spheres basically inside each other. So then we'll delete the planet material. Let's click on new to add new material, and I can rename this to clouds. And then if we go into the rendered viewport mode, it shouldn't be too small so that you can see the planet, but it shouldn't be too big that it covers the atmosphere. So right in between the atmosphere and the planet surface. So now let's create a procedural clouds material. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a noise texture, drop it here, and we can press Ctrl T with the noise texture selected. That's using the Node Wrangler add-on, and we're going to put the object into the vector, so it's using the object coordinates. And let's Control Shift and select the noise texture, preview it. And I'm going to change the scale to a 3.6. I can also turn the detail all the way up to 15, and I'll turn the roughness to a 0.65. And this laconarity here, I'll turn to a 2.5, so it has a little bit of laconarity. Then let's also search for a color ramp to make it more contrasty, drop it here, and I can drag this black tab kind of to about here. I think that's pretty good. And then the white tab, I'll bring this over to about there. So now you can see we have a cool clouds texture. Now I also want to make another clouds texture, so we're going to box select all the nodes, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate and drop them down here. And let's Control Shift and select this one to preview it. And for this one, I'm going to drag the black tab over kind of to about here, and then I'll drag the white tab over just a little bit. And then we can also change some of the noise settings. So I'm going to turn the roughness all the way up to 1. And this distortion here, I'll turn this up to a 0.3, so it has a little bit of distortion. And I think I should do that for the top one here. So this distortion, I'll turn to a 0.3 as well. So it's a little bit more distorted. So it kind of has that wispy look, and the clouds are kind of spinning around, and that looks more realistic. So now we have these two cloud textures and I want to join them together. So if you select both color ramps at once, you can press Ctrl 0 and that is going to add this mix color and it's going to plug them both together. Now I actually want to switch these, so I'm going to put this one into color B and this one I'm going to put into color A. And then on this mix type here, we're going to change this to darken, so it just adds the dark values because you can see the clouds are dark, but then the rest of it is white. Now I'll turn the factor all the way up to 1 and that's going to add both of the clouds. So we have this one here, and then you can see we're mixing them together. So this principled shader is going to be the clouds, but then where there's not the clouds, that needs to be transparent so we can see the planet underneath. So we're going to search for a transparent shader. So search for the transparent BSDF, not the translucent, but the transparent. We're going to drop this down here. And then we also want to mix the principled shader and the transparent together. So we can select both of them and you can press Ctrl 0 and that's going to add this mix shader. And let's Ctrl Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. So we're mixing between the principled shader and the transparent shader. So for the principled shader, I'm going to turn the roughness all the way up to 1. This is going to be the cloud material. And then we can also open up the subsurface and I'll turn the subsurface weight to a 0.5 just to make the clouds a little bit more soft. And then on the transparent color, just make sure that this is fully white so it's fully transparent. So we can now take the darken result and we can put this into the factor. So you can see now where the clouds are, you can see that it is the principled shader, so it's that white color, but then where there's no clouds, it's going to be the transparent shader, and so that way you can see the planet surface underneath the clouds. So now if you want to change any of the cloud settings, you can, so you could make it really sharp if you want to be able to see the clouds better, or make them more subtle. You could also change the scale of the clouds, or you could also change like the roughness or the details or anything that you want. I'm going to leave this how this is, but you can play around with the clouds and make them look different if you want to. So now let's just finish up the scene. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a camera. I'm going to hit the 1 on the numpad to go to the front view and I'll press Control Alt Numpad 0. So Control Alt Numpad 0 is going to bring the camera to where we are. And if you select the camera, you can hit G to grab and you can move the camera around. You can also hit G to grab and then you can double tap the Z key to bring the camera in and out, and I'll just bring the camera out to about there. Let's also go back here to the layout because we don't need to use the shader nodes anymore, so I'll go into the rendered viewport mode, and then you can take this light here and you can move it around and you could kind of see more of the planet if you want to be over here, or you could make less of the planet, you could bring it farther back, really just do whatever you want. Now let's also change the color management. So if I go here to the render properties and scroll down here on the color management, I'll use the view transform of AGX, and then the look here, I'm going to use high contrast, and that'll make the whole scene look nicer. Now we can also open up the sampling here, and on the samples, on the render samples, I'm going to use 100 samples, and I'm also going to turn the denoise so that it denoises the image when we render it. And then also if you go here to the output properties, if you make the resolution higher, it will look a bit nicer. It'll look like really large. If you want to make it a really large image, you can. So I'm going to make it a 2560 by 1440 image. So this is a 2K image, so it's really large. Of course, this will take longer to render. And then also here on the percentage, I'm going to turn this up to like 200. So that way it's going to be like a large 4K image. So it'll be really big and we can see lots of detail. But of course, if this will take too long to render, then you can turn it down. And of course, if you wanted to, you could also use the Eevee rendering engine. This will render fine in Eevee as well, and it actually looks pretty similar in Eevee. Now before we render this, I do want to add a glare in the compositor just to make the atmosphere glow to really finish off the image and make it look really nice. So let's click here to go to the compositing workspace. We'll click on use nodes. And I'm going to go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a glare. Let's drop this down here. And on the streaks here, I'll change this to bloom instead. And then to actually be able to see this showing up, we can click here on the corner and drag out to split the window. Let's click here on the editor type and I will change this to the 3D viewport. Let's go into the rendered viewport mode so we can see it happening. And then if you scroll over here, just scroll with your mouse, you can click on this drop down arrow here, and on the compositor, we can turn this to always so we can see the compositing in the viewport. And then let's hold down the Control and Shift key and select the glare to actually preview it so it's going to show up. So now what we need to do is turn this threshold down, and if we turn the threshold down, the bloom is going to be brighter. So that is way too strong, but I found the threshold of like 0.5 looks pretty good. And then also on the medium here, I'm going to turn it to high quality. So it's high quality, so it'll look a bit nicer. You can also change the size here if you want, so you can make it smaller or bigger. I'll just leave it at the default of 8. So make sure you press Ctrl S to save the Blender file, and then you can press F12 to render the image. And there we go, the image is finished, and you can see there's the stars in the background, and the stars, some of the stars are actually glowing a little bit. So now we can save the final image by just clicking on image and clicking on save as, and just saving the image to your computer. Now some of you also might want to do an animation like you saw at the beginning of the video. So I'm not going to be going over the complete animation process, but I will just show you how to get started with the animation. So if you go back over here to the layout, what you can do is select the camera, and you can move the camera back. So hit G to grab, double tap the Z key, kind of move the camera back, and then you can add a keyframe here by hitting the K button and just adding a location keyframe. Then you can go to the end of your animation, however you want it to end. You can move the camera forward, and then again hit the K button, and you can add another location so that the camera is going to move. And then as far as moving the light, you can just do the same thing. So you can move the light kind of back here, hit the K button, and you can insert location. Then you can go to the very end of your animation, move the light over here. So just move it over wherever you want, and then insert another location keyframe. So now you can see as I play the animation, you can see the sun is moving. And then if you don't know how to render out all the frames to images and export it into a final video, then I have a separate tutorial on my YouTube channel where I show you how to do that. So I'll have a link in the description to that video if you want to check it out. And in that video, I show you how you can save your output and save it out to a folder and render out all the rendered frames. And then I show you how to put them into Blender's video editor and export it out to a finished video. But that'll wrap it up for this tutorial, so I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support this channel to help me keep on creating these free tutorials, then you can purchase the project files with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, you can get access to 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, the project files for this tutorial here, and lots more Blender content. And I do appreciate all of your support. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thank you for watching.